I'm here without you, baby, but you're still on my lonely mind. I think about you, baby, and I dream about you all.
Stop. Just stop right there. If you clicked on this video just to hear a 10-second soundbite, or if you're just here to see a headline, please do us both a favor and click away now. This isn't a news report. This isn't content. This is for the die-hard fans. This is for the kids who grew up in the backseat listening to The Better Life. This is for the soldiers who played his voice in the desert. I am literally broken inside writing this. Every single word you're about to hear, every chapter, every hour of research. I poured my entire soul into this because I loved him. He was the legend. So if you aren't here to honor the life of Brad Arnold, if you aren't ready to feel this pain with me, then please just leave. Don't waste your time. But if you're still here, if you're hurting too, then this is for you.
The silence in Escatawpa, Mississippi, hits different today. It is not the quiet of a sleepy Sunday morning, nor the humid stillness of a summer afternoon before the cicadas start their screaming. It is a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind that settles over a house when the grandfather clock stops ticking, or when the final chord of a song rings out and fades into the hum of an amplifier, leaving only the dead air behind. At 4:12 a.m. this morning, that amplifier was turned off for the last time. The news broke in waves, starting as a murmur on local forums, before crashing onto the shores of the global news cycle. By 9 a.m., the notification was on every smartphone screen from Biloxi to Berlin. Brad Arnold, the reluctant frontman, the drummer-turned-singer, and the soul of Three Doors Down, was dead at age 47. The cause was not the demons that had chased him for decades. It wasn't the bottle that he had famously put down years ago. It wasn't the highway that claims so many touring musicians. It was a secret, silent, and brutal war with stage for kidney cancer. A battle he fought behind the locked gates of his privacy, shielded from the fans who had sung his lyrics back to him for a quarter of a century. To understand the weight of this loss, you have to understand the specific frequency of Brad Arnold's voice. He wasn't the coolest rock star in the room. He didn't possess the serpentine danger of Axl Rose or the brooding art house mystery of Kurt Cobain. Brad was the guy you knew. He was the kid from algebra class who drummed on his desk with pencils. He was the voice of the American interior, the soundtrack to long drives down Interstate 10, the anthem for soldiers deployed in Sandy, foreign lands, and the comfort for teenagers who felt invisible in small towns. When the news hit, the world didn't just lose a celebrity, it felt like losing a neighbor. The shock lies in the secrecy. For 9 months, while the world speculated about canceled tour dates and radio silence, Brad was in the trenches of chemotherapy and palliative care. He chose to die as he had lived in his later years, quietly, humbly, and with a dignity that is rare in the noise of the modern music industry. There were no TMZ leaks, no dramatic hospital photos, just a man, his family, his faith, and the inevitable end. It is a cruel irony that the man who wrote Kryptonite, a song about vulnerability disguised as superhero strength, succumbed to a biological weakness he could not drum his way out of. "If I go crazy, then will you still call me Superman?" he asked us in 2000. Today, the answer rings out in the collective grief of a generation, yes. But even Superman bleeds. This silence is particularly deafening because Brad was the last man standing. The history of Three Doors Down is a tragedy written in slow motion. We watched them rise from a local radio experiment to global superstars, selling 6 million copies of The Better Life almost overnight. But we also watched the cost of that ticket. We watched the original guitarist, Matt Roberts, struggle and fade, eventually dying of an overdose in a hotel hallway in 2016. We watched bassist Todd Harrell spiral into legal oblivion. Through it all, Brad was the anchor. He was the one who admitted his own alcoholism, the one who stared into the abyss of his own liver failure in the mid-2010s and chose life. He got sober. He found God. He rebuilt the band and kept the music playing when everyone else had fallen away. He was the survivor. We took his presence for granted because he was the one who always showed up. He was the reliable narrator of our nostalgia. We thought he had won the war. But cancer is a thief that respects no redemption arc. Today, the radio stations are playing Here Without You on a loop. The lyrics, once a ballad about long-distance relationships and life on the road, have transmuted instantly into an elegy. I'm here without you, baby slash, but you're still on my lonely mind. It hits differently now. It sounds less like a love letter and more like a ghost story. In the coming days, there will be autopsies and memorials. There will be retrospectives on VH1 and rolling tributes in Rolling Stone. Critics who dismissed the band as generic post-grunge in 2002 will suddenly find the poetry in his plain-spoken lyrics. They will realize that his generic quality was actually his superpower. He spoke a universal language of longing and resilience that didn't need a thesaurus to understand. But right now, in this first chapter of grief, we are just sitting in the silence. The drum kit is empty. The microphone stands alone under the stage lights. The bus is parked in the garage, the engine cold. Brad Arnold, the boy from Escatawpa who never really wanted to be the frontman, has finally stepped out of the spotlight. He has gone to join Matt. He has gone to find the peace that the road could never give him. And us, we're left here, looking at the empty space where the music used to be, realizing too late that he was holding up more of the sky than we ever gave him credit for. This is the story of how he got there. This is the story of the math class, the demons, the glory, and the quiet fight. Rest easy, Superman. The show is over. If you look for Escatawpa, Mississippi, on a map, it appears as little more than a smudge of green and gray pressed against the darker vein of the Pascagoula River. It is a place defined by what it is not. It is not the neon flash of Biloxi to the south, nor is it the industrial grind of the shipyards, though the shadows of both loom long over the pine trees. In 1978, the year Brad Arnold was born, Escatawpa was the kind of town where the heat was a physical weight, a humid blanket that settled over the dirt roads and trailer parks, slowing time itself to a crawl. To understand the man who would eventually sell 20 million records, you cannot start with the stage lights of Madison Square Garden. You have to start with the red clay dust. You have to start with the silence of a town where there was absolutely nothing to do, and the noise a boy made to fill it. Brad Arnold came into this world on September 27, 1978, the youngest of 7 children. From the moment he could coordinate his limbs, he was a kinetic force, a bundle of nervous energy that seemed at odds with the slow, drowsy rhythm of the Deep South. While other children were content to catch crawfish in the creek or ride bikes in lazy circles, Brad was possessed by a rhythm he couldn't quite articulate. The legend goes, and it is a legend that has been verified by every weary relative who lived through it, that the Arnold's kitchen cookware was never safe. Before he owned a snare drum, before he ever held a pair of Vic Firth sticks, Brad Arnold was destroying his mother's pots and pans. He would drag them out of the cupboards, arranging them in a semicircle on the linoleum floor, and batter them with wooden spoons until they were dented beyond recognition. It wasn't just noise, it was a language. For a shy kid who often struggled to find the right words, the percussive crack of a spoon against a steel pot was a way to announce his existence. It was loud. It was undeniable. It was the first hint of the Superman who would one day command arenas. Growing up in the 80s in Escatawpa meant existing in a cultural vacuum, but one that was pierced by the radio waves of the classic rock giants. This was Skinner country. This was the land of 38 special and driving guitars. But Brad's ear was tuning into something heavier, something more aggressive that was just starting to bubble up from the underground. But a drummer needs a band, and a band needs brothers. The mythology of Three Doors Down is rooted in the fact that they were not a group of strangers assembled by a record label executive in Los Angeles. They were neighbors. They were kids who grew up drinking the same water and swatting the same mosquitoes. Brad met Matt Roberts and Todd Harrell in the blurred haze of childhood. They were the boys who lived down the road, the ones you ended up with simply because proximity was the only social network that mattered. Matt Roberts, quiet and intense, had a guitar that seemed too big for his hands. Todd Harrell, older and wilder, had a bass and an attitude that screamed rebellion. The chemistry wasn't instant magic, it was born of necessity. In Escatawpa, if you didn't make your own fun, the boredom would swallow you whole. They didn't start playing music to get famous. They started playing music because the alternative was staring at the wall or getting into trouble in the woods. They played in sheds. They played in garages where the humidity was so high it would warp the guitar necks and make the drum skins sound like wet cardboard. They played terrible covers of Bush and Metallica, butchering the chords but capturing the energy. And in the back of that garage, sitting behind a mismatched kit of cheap drums, was Brad. He wasn't the singer then. The idea of standing at a microphone, with nothing between him and the audience, was terrifying to him. He wanted the armor of the tom-toms. He wanted the cymbals to crash around him like a fortress. He was the heartbeat of the noise, happy to be the engine rather than the hood ornament. But fate, as it often does in these stories, had a cruel sense of humor. They couldn't find a singer. No one in Escatawpa had the voice or the nerve to front the band. So, during those sweaty afternoon practice sessions, Brad started humming. Then he started shouting the melodies over the crash of his own cymbals. It was awkward at first. Drumming requires a specific separation of limbs. Right hand, right foot, left foot, all doing different things. To add singing to that equation is a neurological high-wire act. But when he opened his mouth, a sound came out that stopped Matt and Todd in their tracks. It wasn't a trained voice. It was gravel and honey. It was a voice that sounded like it had already lived 1,000 years of heartbreak, despite belonging to a teenager who had barely left the county line. It was the sound of the post-grunge era waiting to be born. The garage days were long and unglamorous. They played for empty rooms. They played for friends who only came for the free beer. But in the heat of those Mississippi nights, something was forging. Brad was learning that his voice could do more than just carry a tune. It could command a room. He was learning that the rhythm he had beaten into those pots and pans as a toddler was the pulse of something much bigger. He was just a kid in a t-shirt, sweating through the humidity, pounding on drums until his hands blistered. He didn't know yet that he was rehearsing for the rest of his life. He didn't know that the melodies floating around in his head would one day be sung by millions. He only knew that when the music played, the silence of Escatawpa disappeared. And for a boy who felt everything too deeply, that was enough. There's a specific kind of boredom that only exists in a high school mathematics classroom at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. It is a thick, fluorescent-lit purgatory where time doesn't just slow down, it coagulates. The air smells of chalk dust, floor wax, and the desperate, collective wish of 30 teenagers to be literally anywhere else. In 1994, inside a classroom at East Central High School in Hurley, Mississippi, 15-year-old Brad Arnold was sitting at a laminate desk, staring blankly at a chalkboard covered in algebraic equations. The numbers held no magic for him. X and Y were just lines on a slate, but the rhythm in his head was relentless. To the teacher, Brad was just another distracted student, a kid with a wandering eye and a tapping pencil. But inside Brad's mind, a revolution was quietly taking place. He wasn't solving for X. He was solving for a melody that had been nagging him all morning. He was tapping his fingers against the hard surface of the desk. Thump, thump, crack, thump, thump, crack. Mimicking a snare drum pattern that felt urgent and driving. He was failing algebra, but he was about to write the song that would define the next decade of rock music. The song didn't start with a profound heartbreak or a political statement. It started as a doodle. Brad opened his spiral-bound notebook, flipping past the half-finished homework assignments, and found a clean page. He began to write, not with the intention of creating a masterpiece, but simply to get the noise out of his head, so he could focus. The words came out in a tumble of teenage anxiety and surprising wisdom. I took a walk around the world to ease my troubled mind. It was a heavy opening line for a kid whose world barely extended past the Jackson County line. But that was the magic of Brad Arnold. He felt the weight of the world before he had even seen it. He kept writing. He wrote about insecurity. He wrote about the fear of being abandoned when the facade of strength cracks. He needed a metaphor, something that represented invincibility, but also fatal weakness. He thought of comic books. He thought of the Man of Steel. If I go crazy, Then will you still call me Superman? It was a question asked by a boy who was trying to figure out his place in the hierarchy of high school, but it resonated with the universal frequency. It wasn't really about Superman. It was about the terrifying realization that we are all frauds, waiting to be found out. It was about asking the people we love if they will stay when the cape comes off, and we are just Clark Kent, stumbling in the dark. Brad wrote the lyrics in about 15 minutes. The teacher was still droning on about quadratic equations. The bell rang. Brad shoved the notebook into his backpack, unaware that he was carrying a winning lottery ticket next to his gym clothes. Later that week, in the cramped, humid garage where the band practiced, Brad pulled out the notebook. He was nervous. The song was simple, almost too simple. It revolved around 3 chords, B minor, G, and A. It didn't have a complex bridge. It didn't have a guitar solo that would shred fingers. I wrote this thing in math class, he told Matt and Todd. It's probably stupid. Matt Roberts picked up his guitar. He didn't laugh. He found the B minor chord, that dark, moody root note that anchors the entire track. Todd locked in on the bass, and Brad, sitting behind the kit, started playing that driving, skipping beat he had practiced on his desk. Dum-da-da-dum-dum, snap. When they played Kryptonite for the first time, the air in the room didn't change immediately. The clouds didn't part. It was just a song. It was catchy, sure. It was fun to play. But they had no concept of radio formatting or hooks. They were just kids making noise. They played it, finished it, and probably moved on to a Metallica cover. But something about the song stuck. It was an earworm. It was the kind of song you hummed after hearing it once. It had a strange, hypnotic quality. The way the verses chugged along like a train and the chorus exploded into a desperate plea. For years, Kryptonite was just another song on their set list at local dive bars and VFW halls. They would play it to rooms of 20 people who were more interested in the pool table than the band. But every time they played it, something happened. The heads would turn. The conversation would dip. The drunk guy at the bar would tap his foot. Brad Arnold had captured lightning in a bottle, using a number 2 pencil in a math class he was failing. He had distilled the angst of the impending millennium into 3 minutes and 53 seconds. It is a testament to the purity of rock and roll that one of the biggest songs in history wasn't manufactured in a boardroom by a team of Swedish songwriters. It wasn't focus grouped. It was birthed in the boredom of the American public school system. It was the product of a mind that refused to be linear, a mind that heard music where others only saw math. Years later, when Kryptonite was being played in every car, every mall, and every frat house in America, people would ask Brad what the secret was. They wanted to know the formula. He would just smile, that shy, humble smile, and tell them the truth. There was no formula. There was just a desk, a melody, and a boy who wanted to be Superman, hoping someone would listen. There is a specific humidity in southern Mississippi that does not just exist in the air. It seeps into the wood, the drywall, and the soul. In the mid-90s, inside a cramped, uninsulated shed behind a house in Escatawpa, that humidity was the 4th member of the band. It warped the necks of cheap guitars. It made the drum skins slack and dead. It turned the air into a physical weight that had to be pushed against, beat by beat. This was the crucible where 3 doors down was forged. Not in a glittering studio with air conditioning and craft services, but in a sweatbox that smelled of mildew, stale cigarette smoke, and the sharp, metallic tang of burning amplifiers. By 1995, the lineup had solidified into a power trio that functioned less like a band and more like a single, malfunctioning organism. There was Matt Roberts on guitar, a quiet, intense kid who treated his instrument with the reverence of a religious artifact. There was Todd Harrell on bass, the older, wilder energy, who played with a swagger that suggested he was already playing stadiums in his head. And tucked away in the back, barricaded behind a wall of cymbals, was Brad Arnold. The dynamic was unusual, even for the time. In the pantheon of rock history, the lead singer is the peacock. He is the one prowling the front of the stage, microphone stand in hand, engaging the audience with hip swivels and eye contact. But Brad was the drummer. He was the engine room. He was physically tethered to his seat. responsible for the heavy lifting of the rhythm while simultaneously trying to project his voice over the crashing noise he was creating with his own hands. It was a physical impossibility that shouldn't have worked. Singing requires breath control, a relaxed diaphragm, and focus. Drumming requires explosive physical exertion, gritted teeth, and counting time. Doing both is like trying to recite Shakespeare while sprinting up a hill. But Brad didn't know it was impossible, so he just did it. He would scream the lyrics of Kryptonite, or duck and run, veins bulging in his neck, sweat stinging his eyes, while his arms thrashed at the snare and toms. It gave the music a frantic, breathless urgency that a polished frontman could never replicate. These were the garage days, a period of time that every band goes through, but few survive. It is the era of the dream colliding violently with reality. The reality was that nobody in Escatawpa, or the neighboring towns of Moss Point and Pascagoula, particularly cared about an original rock band. The local economy was driven by cover bands, groups that could play Sweet Home Alabama and Mustang Sally for the 1,000th time without complaining. To write your own songs was considered arrogant, or worse, boring. Brad, Matt, and Todd didn't care. They were possessed. They would finish their days at school or working odd jobs, and then retreat to the shed. They practiced until their fingers bled, and their ears rang with a permanent tinnitus. They were refining a sound that was distinctively theirs, a blend of the Southern rock heritage they were born into and the darker, angst-ridden post-grunge that was filtering down from Seattle. But a band cannot live in a garage forever. Eventually, you have to face the public. Their first gigs were exercises in humiliation. They played VFW halls, where the average age was 65, and the patrons wanted to hear country waltzes, not distorted power chords. They played backyard parties, where the generator would cut out halfway through the set, plunging them into silence, while drunk teenagers laughed. They played dive bars with sticky floors and chicken wire fences around the stage, venues where the payment was a pitcher of warm beer and a good luck next time. One legendary story from this era involves a gig at a local fairground. The stage was set up on a flatbed trailer. The PA system was a cobbled-together disaster of blown speakers and fraying wires. As they launched into their set, the sky opened up. It didn't just rain. It poured with the tropical violence of a Gulf Coast storm. The few dozen people in the crowd scattered for cover. Most bands would have stopped. They would have packed up their gear to save it from the water. But Brad looked at Matt, and Matt looked at Todd, and they just kept playing. They played to the rain. They played to the empty, muddy field. Brad was shouting into a wet microphone, risking electrocution, drumming harder as the water splashed off his cymbals. In that moment, they weren't playing for fame. They were playing because the music was the only thing that made sense in a chaotic world. It was during these grueling road trips, often just driving an hour to Mobile, Alabama, or Biloxi, that the brotherhood was cemented. They shared everything: the gas money, the single motel room, the cigarettes, the silence. Matt Roberts became Brad's anchor. Matt was the one who could translate Brad's humming into chord progressions. He was the architect who built the house around Brad's lyrics. They developed a nonverbal language, a way of looking at each other across the stage or the garage, and knowing exactly where the song was going next. It was also during this time that they found their name. On a trip to Foley, Alabama, they saw a sign on a dilapidated building. The letters had peeled away, leaving a cryptic message: 3 doors down. It meant nothing, and therefore, it could mean everything. It sounded mysterious. It sounded like a destination. They adopted it, not knowing that those 3 words would one day be printed on tickets in Tokyo and Berlin. As 1996 bled into 1997, the garage started to feel smaller. The songs were getting better. Kryptonite was no longer just a doodle, it was a weapon. They had written Loser, a track with a hook so massive it felt like it could crush a car. They had Life of My Own. The set list was no longer a mix of Metallica and Bush covers. It was an arsenal of original material that was begging to be heard. But the world outside was deaf. The record labels were in New York and Los Angeles, a million miles away from the swamps of Mississippi. To the industry, they were nobodies from nowhere. To the locals, they were just those loud kids from Escatawpa. The pressure began to mount. Brad was nearing the end of high school. The real world, college, jobs, the shipyard, was looming like a storm front. The garage, once a sanctuary, was starting to feel like a prison. They needed a break. They needed a sign that they weren't crazy for believing in this. They needed someone to listen. And as fate would have it, the break wouldn't come from a suit in a skyscraper. It would come from a local radio station, a burned CD, and a phone line that was about to light up and never stop ringing. By 1997, the silence of Escatawpa had been thoroughly shattered, at least within the confines of the Arnold family property. But for Brad, Matt, and Todd, the noise they were making in the shed was beginning to feel like a secret they were desperate to tell. They had the songs. They had the sweat equity. What they didn't have was a way to get the music out of the humid air of Mississippi and into the ears of people who didn't live within driving distance. They needed a tape. In the late 90s, before SoundCloud, Spotify, or social media, the demo tape was the currency of the music underground. It was a physical artifact of ambition, a cassette or a burned CD that a band would press into the hands of anyone who looked important. It was a lottery ticket, and 3 doors down scraped together every dollar they had to buy one. They didn't go to a high-end facility in Nashville or Memphis. They went to a small, local studio that smelled of carpet cleaner and stale coffee. The recording process was fast and dirty. There was no time for endless takes or sonic experimentation. Brad set up his drums, Matt plugged in his amp, and Todd checked his tuning. They played the songs exactly as they had played them in the garage. Loud, urgent, and without a click track. When they listened to the playback of Kryptonite, it wasn't perfect. The production was rough around the edges, but the energy was undeniable. It sounded like 3 guys playing for their lives. It sounded real. Armed with a stack of burned CDs, with 3 doors down scrawled on them in black Sharpie, they began the next phase of the campaign. The assault on local radio. The target was WCPR 97.9, the rock station that broadcast out of Biloxi/Gulfport. To the kids on the coast, WCPR was the Bible. If a song was played on WCPR, it mattered. Getting a local band on the air, however, was notoriously difficult. Program directors were beholden to national charts and corporate playlists. They played Metallica, Stone Temple Pilots, and Soundgarden. They didn't play kids from Escatawpa. But 3 doors down had the kind of naive persistence that only exists in youth. They drove down to the station, CD in hand, hoping to catch a DJ in a good mood. The legend of what happened next has been told 1,000 times, but the reality was likely quieter and more nerve-wracking. They managed to get the CD into the hands of a local DJ who was looking for something new for the homegrown hour, a Sunday night slot usually reserved for obscure local acts that nobody listened to. The DJ agreed to play Kryptonite. Brad, Matt, and Todd huddled around a radio waiting. When the opening guitar riff finally cut through the static, that clean, arpeggiated B minor picking, it felt like the world had stopped spinning. Hearing your own voice coming out of a car dashboard is a surreal, out-of-body experience. For 3 minutes and 53 seconds, they weren't just garage musicians. They were on the same frequency as the rock gods they worshipped. But the real magic happened when the song ended. The phone lines at WCPR lit up. Usually, after a local band played, the lines were dead silent, or maybe a supportive girlfriend would call in. But this time, the board was flashing like a Christmas tree. People were calling from their cars. They were calling from house parties. They were calling from the shipyard night shift. Who was that? Play that Superman song again. Where can I buy that? The DJ was stunned. He played it again an hour later. The phones rang again. By the next day, Kryptonite was being requested more than the new singles by Bush or Matchbox 20. It was a statistical anomaly. A song by an unsigned band, recorded in a cheap studio, was beating out million-dollar major label tracks in the Gulf Coast market. The phenomenon spread like a virus. It moved from the homegrown slot to regular rotation. You couldn't drive down Highway 90 without hearing Brad Arnold asking if you'd still call him Superman. The song became a regional anthem. It was catchy enough for pop radio, but heavy enough for the rock crowd. It was the perfect storm. Suddenly, the live shows changed. They weren't playing to empty rooms anymore. They were booking clubs in Biloxi and Mobile, and the lines were wrapping around the block. People were singing the words back to them. Words that Brad had written in a notebook during math class just a few years prior. The energy at these shows was ferocious. Brad was still behind the drum kit, singing his heart out. But now he was looking out at a sea of people who knew the songs. The feeling of validation was intoxicating. They realized, for the first time, that they weren't crazy. They were right. But the music industry is a small world, and noise travels. The anomaly of an unsigned band dominating a major radio market in the South caught the attention of the gatekeepers in New York City. Record executives, who usually spent their time dining in Manhattan, started looking at maps of Mississippi. The calls started coming in. First, it was smaller indie labels. Then, the big fish began to circle. Universal Republic. In 1999, the band was invited to play a showcase at the legendary CBGB's in New York City. It was a long way from the Shed in Escatawpa. The venue was dark, grimy, and hallowed ground for punk and rock history. The executives were in the back, arms crossed, waiting to see if the Kryptonite kids were the real deal or just a studio fluke. Brad, Matt, and Todd walked onto the tiny stage. They didn't have a light show. They didn't have costumes. They just plugged in and did what they had done in the garage 1,000 times. They played with a desperate, sweaty intensity. By the time the final chord rang out, the executives were no longer crossing their arms. They were reaching for their checkbooks. The garage days were officially over. The demo tape had done its job. The boys from Escatawpa were about to sign a contract that would change their lives, their friendships, and their futures forever. They were leaving the safety of the South and stepping onto the global stage. But as the ink dried on the contract, they had no way of knowing the toll that the better life would eventually take. They only knew that the silence was gone, and the roar of the crowd was just beginning. The turn of the millennium was a strange, feverish time in American culture. We had just survived the phantom panic of Y2K. The economy was booming on a dot-com bubble that was about to burst, and the musical landscape was a fractured war zone. On one side, there was the polished, synchronized pop of NSYNC and Britney Spears dominating TRL. On the other, the aggression of nu metal, Limp Bizkit and Korn was soundtracking suburban rage with drop-tune guitars and DJ scratches. And then, walking quietly down the middle of the road, came three guys from Mississippi who didn't fit into either camp. They didn't dance, and they didn't rap. They just played rock and roll. On February 8th, 2000, Three Doors Down released their debut album, The Better Life. In the modern era of streaming, where albums are often just collections of singles that disappear into the ether after a week, it is hard to overstate the physical weight of a blockbuster album in the year 2000. People didn't just stream music, they drove to Best Buy, stood in line, and paid $16.99 for a plastic jewel case. They held the music in their hands. And in the summer of 2000, it seemed like every single person in America was holding a copy of The Better Life. The explosion was not gradual. It was nuclear. Kryptonite, which had already conquered the Gulf Coast, was now unleashed on the national airwaves. It was inescapable. You couldn't walk into a grocery store, a gym, or a dentist's office without hearing that opening guitar riff. It became the background noise of the year. But the true shock came when the sales figures started rolling in. The album didn't just go gold. It didn't just go platinum. It kept selling. 1 million copies. 2 million. 3 million. Eventually, it would be certified 6x platinum. 6 million people, a population larger than many countries, had bought the diary entries of Brad Arnold. For Brad, the transition was disorienting. A year prior, he was worrying about gas money and math tests. Now he was on MTV. He was doing photo shoots where stylists tried to make him look edgy. He was being flown to Europe to talk to journalists who asked him questions about the Deep South, as if it were a foreign planet. He was 21 years old. The magic of The Better Life was that it wasn't just a one-hit wonder. The critics, many of whom were based in coastal cities and viewed the band with a sneering classism, were ready to write them off as Kryptonite merchants. They called the music generic. They called it meat and potatoes rock. But the public disagreed. When the band released Loser as the second single, it soared. When they released Duck and Run, It became another anthem. And then came Be Like That, a ballad that ended up on the American Pie 2 soundtrack, cementing their place in the pop culture canon of the era. Brad found himself in a paradox. He was one of the most famous voices in the country, yet he was still the shy kid who preferred the back of the stage. He was still the drummer at heart, even though the label had gently but firmly told him that for the live shows and videos, he needed to be the frontman. They hired a touring drummer, pushing Brad out from behind his safety wall of cymbals and up to the microphone stand. It was a vulnerable position. Without the drums to hit, he had to figure out what to do with his hands. He had to learn how to command a crowd of 20,000 people not with rhythm, but with presence. The success brought money, of course. It brought tour buses with leather seats and satellite TV. It brought the ability to buy houses for their parents and trucks that actually started on the first try. But it also brought a relentless, crushing schedule. The demand for 3 Doors Down was insatiable. They weren't just a band anymore, they were a commodity. The record label, seeing the gold mine they had stumbled upon, booked them on a tour that seemed to have no end. They were playing 5, sometimes 6 nights a week. They were zigzagging across the continent, waking up in parking lots in Ohio one day and Arizona the next. This was the beginning of the better life they had named the album after. But as the adrenaline of the debut wore off, the reality of the road began to set in. The isolation of the hotel room, the distance from Escatawpa, the pressure to perform, night after night, regardless of exhaustion or illness. Brad Arnold had asked the world if they would still call him Superman. The world had answered yes, but now they expected him to fly every single night. And as the tour bus rolled on, mile after endless mile, Brad was beginning to realize that even Superman needs to sleep. The year 2000 was a party, but the hangover was waiting just around the bend. There is a romantic mythology surrounding the American road trip. We are taught to view the highway as a symbol of freedom, an open ribbon of asphalt stretching toward a horizon of infinite possibility. But for a touring rock band in the early 2000s, the highway was not a symbol of freedom. It was a treadmill. By the time the better life had settled into its multi-platinum status, 3 Doors Down had ceased to be a group of friends playing music and had transformed into a nomadic corporation. The year 2001 was a blur of motion. They were on the road for nearly 300 days that year. To the average person, that number is an abstraction. To live it, however, is a physical and psychological endurance test that grinds the human spirit down to a fine powder. The tour bus, a sleek, 45-foot tube of steel and tinted glass, became their entire universe. It was a rolling submarine. Inside, the air was recycled and cold, smelling perpetually of diesel fumes, fast food, and air freshener. Outside, the landscape of America, the cornfields of Nebraska, the deserts of Nevada, the pine forests of Georgia, became a meaningless smear of color through the window. For Brad Arnold, life had shrunk to a series of repetitive, disorienting loops. The daily routine was a masterclass in monotony. You wake up at 1 p.m. in a Walmart parking lot or the back alley of an arena. You shuffle into a venue that looks exactly like the venue you played yesterday. Concrete walls, exposed pipes, and the smell of stale beer. You do a sound check. You eat catering that tastes like nothing. You wait for 5 hours. You play the show. You get back on the bus. You drive through the night. You repeat. It was a life of extreme contrasts. For 90 minutes every night, Brad was a god. He stood on stage in front of 15,000 screaming fans, bathed in blinding white light, conducting a choir of strangers who knew every word he had written. The adrenaline dump was massive, a chemical flood of dopamine and serotonin that made him feel invincible. But when the house lights went up and the bus doors hissed shut, the silence was deafening. The come down was brutal. He would go from the roar of an arena to a bunk the size of a coffin, staring at a felt ceiling while the tires hummed against the pavement. This was where the exhaustion began to take root. It wasn't just tired eyes. It was a bone-deep fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. Brad was pushing his body to limits it wasn't designed for. As a singer, his instrument was his throat, and he was abusing it nightly. He was screaming over distorted guitars, pushing his vocal cords to the breaking point, and then waking up to do it again. But the physical toll was secondary to the isolation. Despite being surrounded by a crew of 20 people, techs, managers, drivers, security, Brad often felt profoundly alone. The people around him were on the payroll. They were friends, yes, but they were also employees who needed the machine to keep moving to get paid. There was a pressure to never complain, to never say stop, because stopping meant the money stopped for everyone. He missed Escatawpa. He missed the humidity. He missed the simple, uncelebrated quiet of his parents' porch. He was a boy who loved the dirt and the woods, now trapped in a world of concrete and hotel carpet. He was becoming a stranger to his own life back home. He would call friends, but the conversations were strained. How do you explain to a buddy working at the shipyard what it feels like to play Saturday Night Live? How do they explain to you that they're worried about their mortgage? The gap was widening. It was during this era that the seeds of future darkness were planted. When you are awake at 3 a.m. on a bus in the middle of nowhere, with the adrenaline of the show still rattling in your veins, you look for ways to come down. You look for ways to sleep. You look for ways to numb the ache in your back and the ringing in your ears. Alcohol became a utility before it became a demon. A few beers after the show to relax. A drink to help sleep on the bouncing bus. It was innocent at first, just part of the rock and roll catering rider. But on the road, habits have a way of calcifying into necessities. There were moments of beauty, of course. Watching the sunrise over the Rockies through the windshield. Meeting soldiers who told him that his songs were the only thing getting them through deployment. These moments kept him going. They were the fuel. But the machine was hungry. The label wanted a second album. They wanted more hits. They wanted to know if 3 Doors Down was a fluke or a franchise. So, in the precious few weeks off they had, instead of resting, they were pushed into a rented house to write away from the sun. The title was prophetic. Brad felt like he had been away from the sun, away from the light, away from reality, away from himself for 2 years straight. He was tired. He was lonely. And he was beginning to realize that the better life he had sung about came with a price tag he hadn't bothered to read. The bus rolled on. The miles racked up. And somewhere between Detroit and Dallas, the wide-eyed kid from Mississippi began to fade, replaced by a man who was learning how to survive the very dream he had asked for. In the history of rock and roll, the power ballad is often viewed with a degree of cynicism. It is seen as a strategic move, a calculated attempt by a loud band to soften their image, court the pop charts, and get played at prom dances. But occasionally, a song slips through the cracks of commerce that is so raw, so devoid of artifice, that it transcends a genre entirely. In 2002, as 3 Doors Down hunkered down to record their second album, Away from the Sun, the pressure was suffocating. The industry was waiting for them to fail. The sophomore slump is a graveyard where thousands of bands are buried, having used up their best ideas on their debut. The label needed another Kryptonite. They needed volume. They needed adrenaline. But Brad Arnold wasn't thinking about volume. He was thinking about silence. Here Without You was not written in a boardroom. It was birthed in the lonely, quiet moments of the tour bus and the empty hotel rooms that had become Brad's reality. It started with a simple, clean guitar riff, a descending, melancholic pattern that sounded like rain against a window pane. The lyrics were a direct transcription of Brad's internal monologue. 800 days have made me older since the last time that I saw your pretty face. It wasn't poetry. It was a statement of fact. The road ages you. The distance erodes you. When Brad sang, "I'm here without you, baby, but you're still on my lonely mind," he wasn't performing. He was confessing. When the band brought the song to the producers, there was hesitation. It was soft. It was vulnerable. It featured a string section. For a band known for the driving angst of duck and run, this was a pivot. But when Brad stepped into the vocal booth to record the final take, the room went still. His voice, usually gritty and pushed to the limit, dropped into a lower, warmer register. It cracked with genuine exhaustion. It was the sound of a man who was tired of saying goodbye. The song was released as the third single from Away from the Sun in the summer of 2003, and its impact was immediate and terrifyingly universal. To understand why Here Without You became a cultural phenomenon, you have to look at the world in 2003. The United States had just invaded Iraq. The news cycle was dominated by images of Humvees in the desert, shock and awe, and yellow ribbons tied around oak trees in front yards across America. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers were being deployed, leaving behind wives, husbands, and children who didn't know if they would ever see them again. Brad Arnold had written a song about missing his wife while on tour, but the American public heard a song about a much deeper, more permanent kind of separation. Here Without You became the unofficial anthem of the military families of the mid-2000s. It was played at deployment ceremonies. It was played in barracks in Fallujah and Baghdad. It was played at funerals. The lyrics, "I think about you, and I dream about you all the time," took on a haunting weight when sung by an 18-year-old private cleaning his rifle in a sandstorm, thousands of miles from home. Brad was stunned by the response. He hadn't written a political song. He hadn't tried to make a statement about the war. He had just written about missing someone. But that is the alchemy of great songwriting. Specificity breeds universality. By being honest about his own loneliness, he had created a vessel for the loneliness of millions. The song dominated the charts. It stayed on the Billboard Hot 100 for nearly a year. It crossed over from rock radio to adult contemporary, meaning you were just as likely to hear it in a dentist's waiting room as you were at a biker rally. It cemented Three Doors Down not just as a rock band, but as a staple of American culture. But for Brad, the song became a double-edged sword. Every night on stage, he had to sing it. Every night, he had to reopen that wound of separation. And as the tour stretched on, and the faces in the crowd sang the words back to him with tears in their eyes, the weight of being the emotional conduit for so many people began to press down on him. He was the guy who understood their pain. But who understood his? Here Without You was the moment Three Doors Down moved beyond being a post-grunge band. They stopped being peers of Puddle of Mud or Nickelback in the eyes of the public and became something more enduring. They were now the band that got you through the hard times. Yet, as the strings swelled and the crowd swayed their lighters and later their cell phones in the air, a disconnect was growing. The Brad Arnold singing that tender ballad was struggling to keep his own life together. The loneliness he sang about was real, and it was getting worse. The better life was a paradox. He was loved by millions, but he felt more isolated than ever. The song was a triumph, but in the quiet of the bus after the show, the lyrics rang truer than anyone knew. He was there, without us, and the loneliness was starting to demand a price. There is a peculiar phenomenon in the music industry where success is often inversely proportional to respect. In the early 2000s, Three Doors Down was arguably the biggest rock band in America. They had multi-platinum albums. They had singles that lived on the radio for eternity. They were selling out arenas from Biloxi to Berlin. By every tangible metric of the music business, units moved, tickets sold, royalties generated, they were titans. But if you open the pages of Rolling Stone, Spin, or the burgeoning hipster Bible Pitchfork, you would read a very different story. To the critical establishment, Three Doors Down was not a success story. They were a symptom of a disease. They were labeled derivative, generic, corporate rock, and the ultimate insult of the era, post-grunge. The term post-grunge was wielded like a weapon. It implied that the party was over, that the artistic revolution started by Nirvana and Pearl Jam had been strip-mined, sanitized, and repackaged for mass consumption by bands like Creed, Nickelback, and Three Doors Down. Critics accused them of peddling butt rock, a derogatory term for radio-friendly, mid-tempo rock music designed for frat houses and strip malls. For Brad Arnold, a young man who had poured his genuine anxieties and heartbreaks into these songs, the vitriol was confusing. He wasn't trying to be Kurt Cobain. He wasn't trying to deconstruct the genre or make an art rock statement. He was just a guy from Mississippi who liked loud guitars and catchy melodies. "I don't write songs for critics," Brad would often say in interviews, his voice tinged with a mix of defiance and hurt. "I write songs for the people who buy tickets." And the people were buying tickets in droves. This disconnect revealed a deeper cultural fault line in America, a class divide disguised as aesthetic taste. The critics, largely based in coastal cultural hubs like New York and Los Angeles, valued irony, experimentation, and danger. They wanted rock stars who were unpredictable, political, or avant-garde. But the Three Doors Down fan base didn't care about irony. They were the people of the flyover states. They were the mechanics, the soldiers, the nurses, and the college students who didn't want a lecture. They wanted a melody they could sing along to on the drive home from a double shift. They heard Kryptonite, not as a commercial jingle, but as a song about vulnerability. They heard Here Without You, not as a sappy ballad, but as a mirror of their own long-distance struggles. Brad Arnold was the perfect avatar for this audience precisely because he wasn't cool. He didn't wear eyeliner. He didn't have a carefully curated vintage wardrobe. He wore t-shirts and jeans. He looked like the guy who might fix your HVAC unit or bag your groceries. He was accessible. When he stood on stage, he didn't sneer at the crowd. He thanked them profusely and sincerely, often invoking God and country. To the critics, this earnestness was uncool. To the fans, it was everything. The tension came to a head around the release of their third album, 17 Days, in 2005. The album debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. It was a heavier, darker record, featuring hits like Let Me Go. The band was firing on all cylinders. Bob Seger, the legend of Heartland rock, even collaborated with them, offering a stamp of approval that meant more to Brad than any 5-star review ever could. Yet, the reviews remained lukewarm to hostile. One critic dismissed them as audio wallpaper. Another called them the musical equivalent of Applebee's. It gnawed at the band. No artist, no matter how rich, is immune to the desire to be taken seriously. There were nights on the bus where the criticism stung. They were working harder than almost anyone in the industry, playing through sickness and exhaustion, only to be told they were lazy songwriters. But the vindication happened every night at 9 p.m. The moment the house lights went down and the roar of the crowd washed over the stage, the critics' words evaporated. You cannot argue with 20,000 people singing every word of Be Like That. You cannot call an emotion generic when you see a grown man in the front row crying during When I'm Gone. Brad eventually made peace with his place in the ecosystem. He realized that his job wasn't to impress the tastemakers. His job was to be the soundtrack for the lives of regular people. He was the guardian of the middle lane, the keeper of the flame for straight-ahead American rock and roll. While the cool bands of 2005, the garage rock revivalists like the Strokes or the White Stripes, were being faded in magazines, Three Doors Down was quietly building a legacy that would outlast the hype cycles. They were building a catalog of songs that would become staples of classic rock radio for decades. The critics viewed them as a product of the early 2000s, destined to fade. But the people kept listening. The people kept calling the radio stations. And Brad Arnold kept writing, proving that sometimes the simplest songs are the ones that carry the most weight. He had won the popular vote, and in the end, that was the only election that mattered. If you were between the ages of 15 and 25 in the early 2000s, your life had a very specific background score. It was the era of the CD burner, the oversized cargo short, and the blockbuster teen comedy. It was a time before the fragmentation of the internet, a final fleeting moment of monoculture where everyone seemed to be watching the same movies and listening to the same radio stations. And sitting comfortably at the center of this cultural Venn diagram was Three Doors Down. By the mid-2000s, the band had achieved a level of ubiquity that is almost impossible to replicate in the modern algorithmic age. They weren't just a band, they were the atmosphere. You couldn't walk through a mall, sit in a waiting room, or attend a high school graduation without hearing Brad Arnold's voice. They had become the default setting for American rock music. This phenomenon was cemented, quite literally, by a pie. When the band was tapped to write a song for the soundtrack of American Pie 2, they were entering a franchise that defined the crude, sweet, and anxious energy of the millennial generation. The resulting track, Be Like That, became an anthem for the uncertainty of growing up. The music video, featuring the band playing on the roof of the house from the movie, is a perfect time capsule of 2001. But the American Pie generation wasn't just about a movie. It was about a specific feeling in the air. The 90s were over. The deep, brooding cynicism of grunge had faded. The world had changed violently on September 11th, 2001, and in the aftermath, The American public wasn't looking for danger in their music. They were looking for comfort. They were looking for stability. Three Doors Down provided that stability. Their music was sturdy. It was built on major chords, reliable drum beats, and lyrics that dealt with universal themes: home, loss, love, and resilience. They were the musical equivalent of a Ford F-150. Maybe not the flashiest vehicle on the road, but the one you trusted to get you there when the weather turned bad. This era marked the peak of their cultural saturation. Brad Arnold, the shy kid from Escatawpa, had inadvertently become the voice of the American prom. Here Without You was the slow dance song for the class of 2004. When I'm Gone was the montage song for the varsity football team's highlight reel. They were the soundtrack to first kisses in Honda Civics and long drives back to college dorms. For Brad, this level of integration into people's lives was humbling, but also strange. He would meet fans who told him, "We played your song at my brother's funeral." And in the next breath, someone would say, "We got drunk to Kryptonite at spring break." He was holding the keys to the entire emotional spectrum of his audience. But being the soundtrack of a generation comes with a hidden cost. It freezes you in time. To the public, Brad Arnold wasn't allowed to age. He wasn't allowed to change. He was expected to be the eternal 22-year-old, singing about Superman. The band was trapped in amber, preserved as the perfect specimen of early 2000s rock. Behind the scenes, however, the American Pie lifestyle was beginning to rot. The party that had started in 1999 had gone on too long. The alcohol, which had started as a social lubricant and a sleep aid, was becoming a necessity. The relentless touring schedule, the very thing that made them ubiquitous, was grinding the band members down to their nerves. Matt Roberts, the quiet architect of their sound, was struggling with anxiety and the physical pain of playing guitar every night. Todd Harrell was beginning to drift into more dangerous waters. And Brad was the captain of the ship, smiling for the cameras, singing the hits, and drinking to numb the creeping realization that he was tired. So incredibly tired. The American Pie generation saw Three Doors Down as the guys who had it all figured out. They were the success story. But the lyrics of their songs, often dismissed as generic, were actually flashing red warning lights. If I could be like that, I would give anything / just to live one day in those shoes. Brad was singing about wanting to be someone else, somewhere else. But the world was too busy singing along to hear the desperation in his voice. They were too busy enjoying the summer of their lives to notice that the leaves were starting to turn brown. As the decade pushed toward 2010, the cultural tide began to shift. The iPod replaced the CD. Indie rock and electronic dance music began to displace the guitar bands on the charts. The American Pie era was ending. But Three Doors Down didn't stop. They couldn't stop. They were a machine built for the road, and the road has no exit ramps. They kept driving, kept playing, and kept drinking, unaware that the cliff edge was approaching fast. The party was over, but the demons were just waking up. There's a myth in rock and roll that addiction is a loud, chaotic event. We are trained by movies and tabloids to look for the car crashes, the hotel room trashings, and the public meltdowns. We expect the rock star to go out in a blaze of glory. But for Brad Arnold, the descent into alcoholism was not a crash. It was a slow, quiet drowning. By 2009, Three Doors Down was an institution. They were a touring machine that generated millions of dollars annually. To the outside world, Brad was the picture of stability. He was the good guy of rock, polite in interviews, gracious to fans, and seemingly immune to the excesses that had claimed so many of his peers. He didn't have a drug scandal. He didn't have a string of broken marriages played out in the press. But behind the tinted windows of the tour bus, a different reality was taking hold. Brad's relationship with alcohol began as a utility. In the early days, a few beers were the currency of the garage. Then, on the road, alcohol became a tool for sleep. When you finish playing a show at 11 p.m., your body is flooded with adrenaline. Your heart is racing, your ears are ringing, and your mind is replaying every missed note. Yet, the schedule demands that you sleep immediately so you can wake up at 8 a.m. for a radio interview. The bottle became the off switch. However, As the years ground on and the pressure of being the frontman intensified, the utility shifted. Brad was naturally shy. He was an introvert thrust into one of the most extroverted jobs on the planet. Alcohol became the armor he wore to face the world. It smoothed out the rough edges of his anxiety. It made the meet and greets bearable. It made the endless hours of travel pass in a warm, fuzzy blur. But the insidious nature of addiction is that the medicine eventually becomes the poison. By 2010, the off switch was broken. Brad wasn't just drinking to sleep. He was drinking to function. The ritual started earlier in the day. A drink to steady the nerves before the show. A drink during the set to keep the energy up. A drink after the show to come down. The cycle was relentless. The physical toll on his body was compounded by the sheer volume of shows. He was performing with a level of intensity that would exhaust an athlete, but he was fueling his body with empty calories and poison. His face began to bloat. The spark in his eyes, once so bright and eager in the Kryptonite video, began to dull. He was present physically, but spiritually, he was checking out. The scariest part for those around him was that Brad was a high-functioning alcoholic. He didn't miss cues. He didn't fall off the stage. He hit the high notes. He showed up on time. This competence was his greatest enemy because it allowed him to deny that there was a problem. I'm doing my job, he could tell himself. I'm paying the bills. I'm holding it together. But inside, he was rotting. The lyrics of the album Time of My Life, 2011, hint at the struggle, though few critics picked up on it at the time. Songs about perseverance and fighting through darkness weren't just generic rock themes. They were pleas for help. Brad was writing about a war that was happening inside his own liver and brain. The isolation of the addiction was profound. Drinking is often a social activity, but for the alcoholic, it ends in solitude. It ends alone in a hotel room, staring at the minibar, calculating how much is left. It ends with the shame of hiding empty bottles, so the housekeeping staff won't judge you. It ends with waking up in a panic, hands shaking, needing a drink just to feel normal enough to brush your teeth. It wasn't just Brad. The entire ecosystem of the band was becoming toxic. Matt Roberts, his childhood friend and guitarist, was fighting his own battle with prescription medication and anxiety. The brotherhood that had formed in the Escatawpa garage was fracturing under the weight of chemical dependency. They were drifting apart, each man locked in his own private silo of pain, unable to reach out to the others because they were all drowning in the same sea. There were moments of clarity, terrifying glimpses of the bottom, moments where Brad would look in the mirror and not recognize the swollen, red-faced man staring back, moments where he would promise himself, "Tonight, I won't drink." But the addiction was stronger than the promise. The road was too long, the night was too quiet, and the bottle was always there, a faithful and deadly companion. He was the captain of a sinking ship, saluting the crowd while the water rose around his ankles. And the tragedy was that the crowd was cheering so loud, they couldn't hear him gasping for air. The human body is a resilient machine, capable of absorbing immense amounts of punishment. It can run on adrenaline, caffeine, and alcohol for years, compensating for the damage in silence. But eventually, the bill comes due. For Brad Arnold, the bill arrived not in a courtroom or a jail cell, but in the terrifying quiet of his own home, in the form of a physical collapse that no amount of willpower could ignore. By 2015, the functional phase of his alcoholism was over. The armor he had built to survive the road had become a cage. He was drinking around the clock. The lines between day and night, between showtime and downtime, had dissolved into a continuous gray haze. The crash wasn't a single dramatic event like a car accident. It was a biological revolt. Brad started noticing that his hands would shake uncontrollably if he went too long without a drink. He felt a constant, dull ache in his side, his liver and kidneys whispering that they were reaching their limit. His skin took on a pallid, unhealthy tone. The man who had once been a bundle of kinetic energy behind the drum kit was now lethargic, bloated, and visibly ill. The breaking point came in January 2016. It was a time of reckoning. Brad had just finished another grueling run of shows, and he was back in Mississippi. The adrenaline of the tour had faded, leaving him alone with the damage. He realized with a sudden, cold clarity, that he was dying. It wasn't a metaphor. He could feel his life force draining away. He looked in the mirror and didn't see a rock star. He saw a ghost. I knew that if I didn't stop, I wasn't going to be here next year, he would later admit to close friends. It wasn't about the music anymore. It was about seeing my next birthday. The decision to get sober is often romanticized in movies as a heroic montage. In reality, it is a terrifying leap into the unknown. For Brad, alcohol had been his primary coping mechanism for nearly 2 decades. It was how he dealt with stress, how he dealt with shyness, how he dealt with the pressure of fame. To remove it was to strip himself naked in a snowstorm. He checked himself into treatment. The detox process was brutal. When you strip the alcohol away from a dependent brain, the nervous system fires back with a vengeance. The tremors, the sweats, the insomnia, the crushing anxiety. It was a physical exorcism. For a man used to being in control, used to commanding arenas, being reduced to a shivering patient in a hospital bed was a humbling, shattering experience. But in that darkness, something shifted. As the fog of alcohol began to lift, Brad rediscovered a part of himself he thought was lost. The kid from Escatawpa. He realized that he didn't need the liquid courage to be Brad Arnold. He realized that the anxiety he had been medicating was actually made worse by the drinking, not better. The alcohol hadn't been shielding him. It had been suffocating him. His sobriety date, January 19th, 2016, became a second birthday. It marked the start of his better life. The one he had sung about but never actually lived. Returning to the stage sober was the next great hurdle. The first few shows were terrifying. For the first time in years, he walked out to the microphone without the chemical buffer. He could see the faces in the crowd clearly. He could feel every nerve ending firing. But as he sang the first notes, he realized something profound. His voice was better. It was clearer. The raw power that had been dampened by the booze was back. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was present. However, the universe has a cruel sense of timing. Just as Brad was pulling himself out of the wreckage, finding his footing, and preparing to lead 3 doors down into a new, healthy era, tragedy was waiting in the wings. He had saved himself, but he couldn't save everyone. While Brad was celebrating his first months of clarity, his brother in arms, the man who had stood beside him in the garage and on the world's biggest stages, was losing his own battle. The crash was over for Brad, but for Matt Roberts, the road was about to run out completely. The joy of Brad's recovery was about to be eclipsed by the darkest day in the band's history. Recovery is a fragile thing. In the summer of 2016, Brad Arnold was walking on new legs. He was 7 months sober, clear-headed, and rediscovering the joy of music without the fog of alcohol. He was the survivor of his own war. But in the narrative of 3 Doors Down, survival often felt like a lottery. And on a humid night in Wisconsin, the other shoe finally dropped with a sound that would echo for the rest of Brad's life. To understand the magnitude of the loss, you have to understand who Matt Roberts was to Brad Arnold. They weren't just bandmates who met through a manager. They were blood brothers of the Escatawpa soil. They had grown up together in the heat and the dust. Matt was the quiet, intense architect of the band's sound, the man whose arpeggiated guitar riffs gave Kryptonite, and Here Without You their haunting melodic spine. While Brad was the voice, Matt was the atmosphere. But Matt had been fighting a war of his own for years. In 2012, Matt had left the band. The official reason was health issues, problems with blood circulation in his hands that made playing guitar excruciatingly painful. It was a tragedy for a musician to be betrayed by his own body, to have the very hands that built his fortune turn against him. But beneath the physical pain, there were other shadows. Anxiety, insomnia, the quiet, creeping dependency on prescription medication to manage the pain and the noise in his head. When Matt left, it was an amicable split, but it left a hole in Brad's universe. The guy who had stood to his right on stage for 15 years was gone. Fast forward to August 2016. Matt Roberts was 38 years old. He was technically retired from the rock star life, but he was trying to dip his toes back in. He was scheduled to play a charity event for veterans in West Bend, Wisconsin. It was supposed to be a low-pressure gig, a chance to play some songs, honor the troops, and feel the electricity of a crowd again. His father, Darrell Roberts, who had been a constant presence and guardian throughout Matt's life, was with him. They were staying in adjoining rooms at a Hampton Inn. It was a scene of domestic normalcy. A father and son on a trip, preparing for a show. On the night of August 19th, Matt rehearsed until 1 a.m. He was in good spirits. He sounded great. He went back to the hotel, told his dad he would see him in the morning, and closed the door to his room. He never opened it again. The next morning, police were called to the hotel. Matt Roberts was found dead in the hallway. The cause was later determined to be an overdose involving prescription medication. The news traveled down the phone lines to Mississippi like a shockwave. For Brad Arnold, who was fighting every day to stay sober, the call was a sledgehammer blow. It was the nightmare scenario that every recovering addict fears. The death of the friend who didn't make it out. The grief was compounded by a complex, suffocating layer of survivor's guilt. Why Brad? Why was the singer, who had consumed enough alcohol to kill a horse, allowed to wake up and see the sunrise, while the quiet, gentle guitarist was gone at 38? They had walked the same road. They had ridden the same bus. They had shared the same dreams in the same garage. Yet their paths had diverged in the final mile. Brad didn't speak publicly immediately. The pain was too raw. When you lose a friend like that, someone who holds the keys to your childhood memories, you don't lose just a person. You lose a witness. Matt was one of the few people on Earth who remembered the bad gigs in 1996. He remembered the smell of the shed. He remembered the moment Kryptonite was written. With him gone, those memories became Brad's burden to carry alone. The funeral in Mississippi was a somber reunion. The Escatawpa sky was heavy and gray. The community, which had watched these boys conquer the world, now watched them bury one of their own. For Brad, this was the ultimate test of his sobriety. The temptation to numb the pain, to drown the grief in a bottle, must have been screaming in his ears. To lose your musical soulmate just months into your own recovery is a cruelty that breaks lesser men. But Brad didn't drink. Instead, he leaned into the only other thing he knew, the music. In the concerts that followed, Here Without You transformed again. It had gone from a love song to a soldier's anthem, and now it became a eulogy. When Brad sang it on stage in the aftermath of Matt's death, he wasn't singing to a fictional lover. He was singing to the empty space on the stage where Matt used to stand. He was singing to the ghost in the wings. I'm here without you, baby slash, but you're still on my lonely mind. The fans knew. They could hear the crack in his voice. They could see the way he would glance over his shoulder, as if expecting to see Matt nodding along to the rhythm. The song became a nightly ritual of grief, a public mourning for a private loss. Matt Roberts was the first of the original brotherhood to fall, but his death signaled the final end of the band's innocence. The better life had extracted its pound of flesh. Brad Arnold was now the last guardian of the legacy, standing in the wreckage, holding the microphone, determined to keep singing even as his heart was breaking. The tragedy of Matt Roberts wasn't just that he died young. It was that he died just as he was trying to come back to the light. And for Brad, it was a brutal reminder that the darkness is always waiting, just outside the door. By the time the sun set on Matt Roberts' funeral in 2016, the foundation of 3 Doors Down had already been quietly eroding for years. But while Matt's departure and subsequent death were tragic, they were, in a sense, quiet. They were internal battles, fought in the shadows of hotel rooms and doctors' offices. The fall of Todd Harrell, the band's original bassist and the wild, swaggering counterweight to Brad's shyness, was loud, public, and devastating. If Matt was the band's melodic soul, Todd was its muscle. In the early days in Escatawpa, Todd was the one who drove the van. He was the one with the rock star attitude before they had sold a single record. He played his bass low, aggressive, and with a confidence that made you believe they were destined for greatness. But the same reckless energy that made him captivating on stage was a liability in the real world. As Brad Arnold fought to maintain his newfound sobriety in the wake of Matt's death, he was forced to watch his other brother, the last link to the garage days, self-destruct in slow motion. Todd's spiral had begun years earlier. It was a chaotic mix of substance abuse and legal troubles that played out in mugshots and court dockets rather than liner notes. In 2013, the situation turned catastrophic. Todd was involved in a vehicular homicide incident in Nashville. He was speeding. He was under the influence. A man lost his life. For Brad, the news was a gut punch that winded him. This wasn't just a rock star behaving badly story. This was a tragedy that had destroyed a family and ended a life. The band, which had always prided itself on being a tight-knit family unit, was forced to make the impossible decision to suspend Todd. They couldn't condone it. They couldn't ignore it. But the final blow came later. Even after the Nashville incident, there was a faint hope that Todd might find redemption, that he might serve his time and come out clean. Instead, the spiral tightened. More arrests followed, probation violations, charges of introducing narcotics into a correctional facility. In 2018, the judge's gavel fell, and Todd Harrell was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The realization hit Brad with the force of a physical blow. He was it. He looked around the stage during soundcheck in late 2018. To his left was a guitarist who was incredibly talented, but hadn't been there when they wrote Kryptonite in the shed. Behind him was a drummer who was a technical wizard, but hadn't been there when they played for 5 people in a dive bar in Mobile. Brad Arnold was the last man standing. The psychological weight of this cannot be overstated. When you start a band with your friends in high school, you share a specific, nonverbal language. You share the inside jokes, the memories of the terrible van breakdowns, the shared trauma of the struggle. You are witnesses to each other's lives. With Matt gone and Todd incarcerated, Brad became the sole custodian of the band's history. He was the only one who remembered the specific humidity of that garage in 1996. This isolation created a strange paradox. 3 Doors Down was technically alive. They were touring. They were selling tickets. The brand was strong. But for Brad, it felt like piloting a ghost ship. He was surrounded by professionals, by hired guns who did their jobs perfectly. Yet he felt a profound loneliness standing at that microphone. The media often asked him about it. "What's it like being the only original member?" they would ask, looking for a soundbite about drama or infighting. Brad would smile that sad, weary smile and say, "It's different." He wouldn't drag Todd through the mud. He wouldn't speak ill of the dead. He protected them, even when they couldn't protect themselves. He carried their legacy because they were no longer able to carry it themselves. But in the quiet moments on the bus, staring out at the passing highway lights, the survivor's guilt would creep back in. Why had he survived? He had drunk just as much as they had. He had lived the same lifestyle. He had walked the same razor's edge. Why was he allowed to find God, to find sobriety, and to find a better life, while his brothers were lost to death in prison? It was a question without an answer. During this period, Brad's performance style changed. He became more intense, more focused. He wasn't just singing for the crowd anymore. He was singing for the ghosts. When he performed The Road I'm On, a song about the disorientation of fame, he sang it with a new, biting anger. When he sang It's Not My Time, it felt like a defiant declaration of survival against the odds. He realized that the band was no longer just a group of guys. It was an entity that belonged to the fans. The fans didn't care about the lineup changes as much as they cared about the songs. They needed Kryptonite. They needed Here Without You. And as long as Brad Arnold was standing there, voice intact, the spirit of the band was alive. He accepted his role as the last man, standing not as a victory, but as a duty. He would keep the lights on. He would keep the bus moving. He would sing the songs that Matt and Todd helped build, ensuring that even though they were gone, their work would never be forgotten. But the loneliness of the spotlight was growing colder. And though he had conquered the bottle and survived the heartbreak of his bandmates, the final boss, the one growing silently inside his own body, was yet to reveal itself. If the middle years of 3 Doors Down were defined by entropy, by the slow, chaotic decay of the original Brotherhood, then the period beginning in 2019 was defined by something unexpected: resurrection. Brad Arnold had survived the bottle. He had survived the death of Matt Roberts. He had survived the imprisonment of Todd Harrell. He was the last man standing in the wreckage of his youth. But instead of letting the band limp into obscurity as a nostalgia act, Brad did something remarkable. He caught a second wind. This renewal wasn't driven by a desire for more platinum records or arena tours. It was driven by a profound internal shift. In the quiet aftermath of the chaos, Brad had found God. Now, finding God is a cliché in the rock and roll recovery narrative. It is often viewed with skepticism, seen as a crutch replaced by another crutch. But for Brad, faith wasn't a public relations strategy. It was a survival mechanism. It was the anchor that stopped him from drifting back into the abyss. He didn't become a preacher on stage. He didn't start writing contemporary Christian music. But the energy shifted. There was a lightness to him that hadn't been there since the garage days. Physically, he transformed. The bloat of the alcohol years melted away. He started running. He started lifting weights. By the time the band hit the road for the 20th anniversary tour of The Better Life in 2021, Brad Arnold was in the best shape of his life. At 43 years old, he looked younger, sharper, and more dangerous than he had at 25. The shows during this era were electric. The fans, who had stuck by the band through the lineup changes and the tragedies, sensed the difference. Brad wasn't just getting through the set anymore. He was attacking it. He was running laps around the stage, high-fiving the front row, his voice soaring over the mix with a clarity that cut like a knife. He had made peace with his legacy. For years, he had fought against the generic label, fought to prove he was more than just Kryptonite. Now he embraced it. He realized that those songs belonged to the people. When he sang When I'm Gone, he wasn't singing it for himself. He was singing it for the veteran in the wheelchair in the third row. He was singing it for the single mother who had played it at her father's funeral. He became a servant of the music, rather than its master. This period was also marked by a deep sense of gratitude. Brad would often stop the show, not to give a rehearsed speech, but to genuinely look at the crowd and say, "Thank you for sticking with us." He knew how close he had come to losing it all. He knew that by all statistical models of the music industry, he should have been washed up or dead. Every show was a bonus round. The band, now staffed by Greg Upchurch, Chris Henderson, Chet Roberts, and Justin Boltonen, was tighter than ever. They were a well-oiled machine, free from the drama and substance abuse that had plagued the earlier years. The tour bus was no longer a party dungeon. It was a place of rest and camaraderie. Brad spoke often of how much he loved these guys, how they had helped him rebuild the house that alcohol had almost burned down. But the most poignant aspect of this second wind was the peace Brad found at home. He bought a farm in Tennessee, trading the chaos of the road for the silence of the woods. He spent his days on a tractor, clearing brush, feeding horses, and living the simple, quiet life he had always craved. He was finally comfortable in his own skin. The nervous kid from Escatawpa had become a wise, gentle man who loved his wife, loved his land, and loved his God. In 2023, the band played a series of massive shows. They were headlining festivals again. They were playing to crowds of 50,000 people who sang every word. It felt like a victory lap. It felt like the happy ending to the movie. The protagonist had slain his demons, saved the band, and was riding off into the sunset. Brad was happy. He was healthy. He was sober, which makes what happened next so unspeakably cruel. The universe, it seems, is indifferent to redemption arcs. Just as Brad was settling into this golden era, just as he was finally taking a deep breath of clean air, the cells inside his own body were quietly beginning to mutate. The pain in his back, which he dismissed as the result of farm work or aging, was not a pulled muscle. It was the first whisper of the final enemy. The second wind was real. It was beautiful. It gave us 5 more years of Brad Arnold at his absolute peak. But it was also the deep breath before the plunge. The storm had passed, yes, but the night was coming. There's a specific kind of silence that exists in a doctor's office the moment after a sentence is spoken, but before the brain has fully processed its meaning. It is a vacuum. The hum of the air conditioner stops. The traffic outside the window ceases. The world narrows down to the movement of lips and the weight of words that cannot be taken back. In May 2025, Brad Arnold sat in such a room in Nashville, Tennessee, and listened to the world stop. For weeks, there had been a nagging pain in his lower back. He was 46 years old. He lived on a farm. He spent his days lifting feed bags, driving tractors, and throwing himself around stages for 2 hours a night. A backache was not an alarm bell. It was the price of admission for the life he led. He treated it with ice, ibuprofen, and the stubborn stoicism of a man who had played through broken bones and the flu for decades. But the pain didn't leave. It shifted. It grew teeth. It became a dull, throbbing presence that woke him up in the middle of the night, whispering that something was wrong in the machinery. He went in for what he assumed would be a routine checkup. Maybe a slip disc. Maybe a kidney stone. He expected a prescription and a lecture about taking it easy. Instead, the scans revealed a shadow. The medical terminology for stage 4 renal cell carcinoma is cold and clinical. It speaks of masses, metastasis, and survival rates. But to Brad, sitting on the crinkling paper of the exam table, it sounded like a foreign language. Cancer. The word felt impossible. He was in the best shape of his life. He was sober. He ran miles. He had just played to 50,000 people. How could he be dying? The doctor explained the gravity of the situation. The tumor on his kidney was aggressive. It had already spread. The second wind was over. The storm had returned, and this time, it was a hurricane. The drive back to his farm that afternoon was a blur. The Tennessee landscape, usually a source of peace, looked different. The trees looked fragile. The sky looked indifferent. Brad had to go home and tell his wife, Jennifer, that the future they had planned, the growing old together on the porch, the quiet years after the touring stopped, was being rewritten in real time. The days following the diagnosis were a masterclass in compartmentalization. Brad made a decision that would define his final year. He would not make this a public spectacle. He had lived his life in the spotlight. He had shared his addiction, his grief, and his redemption with the world. But this was too personal. He didn't want the pity. He didn't want the get well soon hashtags. He didn't want the fans to look at him and see a patient. He wanted them to see Superman. So, he kept the secret. Only the absolute inner circle knew. The bandmates, Chris, Greg, Chet, Justin, were told in hushed tones. These men, who had stood by him through the chaos of the early years, were now sworn to the heaviest secrecy of their lives. They had to walk on stage, look at their brother, and play the songs, knowing that the clock was ticking louder than the metronome. The summer of 2025 became a surreal performance art piece. Brad Arnold was playing shows while undergoing the initial brutal waves of treatment. He would walk off stage, adrenaline crashing, and collapse into a chair, his body screaming from the cancer and the medication. But on stage, he was flawless. He hit the notes. He smiled. He told the stories. There's a specific bravery in that deception. To stand in front of a crowd that loves you, to hear them scream your name, and to know that you are saying goodbye to them without them knowing it. It requires a strength that goes beyond physical endurance. He sang Kryptonite with a new, devastating subtext. If I go crazy, then will you still call me Superman? The question was no longer about mental stability. It was about physical frailty. If I wither away, if I lose my hair, if I can't stand up, will you still love me? The chemo began to take its toll. The back pain became a constant, agonizing companion. The energy that had defined his resurrection began to bleed away. But Brad refused to cancel the dates immediately. He wanted one last summer. He wanted to feel the heat of the lights and the roar of the crowd one last time before the silence took over. He was fighting for his life in the daylight and playing rock star in the moonlight. It was the ultimate act of defiance. He was looking death in the eye and refusing to blink, refusing to let it steal the thing he loved most until he had absolutely no choice. But cancer is a relentless negotiator. It doesn't care about tour schedules or willpower. By the end of the summer, the physical reality was becoming impossible to hide. The weight was dropping off his frame. The exhaustion was bone deep. The doctors were firm. You have to stop. You have to fight this with everything you have, or you won't make it to Christmas. The decision to pull the plug on the tour was the hardest of his career. It wasn't just canceling a job. It was admitting that the Superman cape was heavy, and he could no longer carry it. In August 2025, the press release went out. It was vague. Unforeseen health issues. Need to rest. The fans were disappointed but supportive, assuming it was just burnout or a minor injury. They didn't know that Brad was retreating to his fortress to fight the final boss. As the tour buses pulled away for the last time, leaving Brad at the gate of his farm, the silence returned. But this wasn't the peaceful silence of the woods he loved. It was the ominous silence of a battlefield before the first shot is fired. The public life of Brad Arnold was over. The private war for his soul had begun. On August 24th, 2025, a notification pinged on millions of phones across the world. It was a standard press release, the kind that music journalists skim over and fans read with a sinking feeling in their stomachs. The headline was dry and corporate. 3 Doors Down announces cancellation of remaining 2025 tour dates due to unforeseen health issues. To the casual observer, it was just another band burning out. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was a contract dispute. To the cynics on Reddit, it was fuel for speculation. Did Brad fall off the wagon? Is the band breaking up? The rumor mill, which abhors a vacuum, began to fill the silence with noise. They speculated about rehab. They speculated about vocal nodules. They speculated about everything except the terrifying truth. While the internet argued, Brad Arnold was sitting on the porch of his farm in Tennessee, watching the sun set over the tree-line, knowing that he had likely sung his last note. The decision to cancel the tour wasn't made in a boardroom. It was made in a bedroom. The chemotherapy, which they had hoped would shrink the tumors and buy him time, had turned on him. The side effects were ravaging his body. The back pain had metastasized into a full-body siege. The simple act of standing upright for 90 minutes had become a physical impossibility. The Superman cape wasn't just heavy, it was crushing him. Walking away from the road was a specific kind of grief. For 25 years, Brad's internal clock had been set to the rhythm of the tour. Wake up, drive, soundcheck, play, sleep. It was a grueling cycle, but it was his cycle. It was the only life he knew. To suddenly stop, to park the bus and send the crew home, felt like amputating a limb. He worried about the crew. He worried about the guys in the band. He worried about the fans who had booked flights and hotels for the upcoming shows. Even as his body was failing, his instinct was to serve, to not let people down. It took his wife, Jennifer, and his doctors to finally look him in the eye and say, "Brad, you have to be selfish now. You have to fight for you." The retreat to the farm was absolute. The gates were locked. The world of interviews, meet and greets, and photo shoots was sealed off. Brad Arnold, the rock star, ceased to exist. In his place was just Brad, a husband, a son, and a patient. The transition was jarring. 1 week, he was standing in front of 20,000 screaming people in Charlotte. The next, he was sitting in a recliner, hooked up to N4, watching the leaves change color through a window pane. The silence of the countryside, which he had once craved as a respite, now felt heavy. It was the silence of waiting. But in that silence, something profound happened. Stripped of the adulation and the noise, Brad found a deeper layer of courage. He realized that the privacy he had insisted upon was the right choice. He didn't want to spend his final months managing the emotions of millions of strangers. He didn't want to see the pity in their eyes. He wanted to look at his wife and see love, not fear. He wanted to look at his dogs playing in the yard and see life, not a countdown. He refused to let the cancer define his identity. When friends, the few who knew, would visit, he forbade them from treating him like a dying man. They talked about trucks. They talked about football. They talked about God. They laughed. He was determined to squeeze every ounce of normalcy out of the time he had left. Yet there were dark nights. Nights when the pain was a living thing. Nights when the medication fogged his brain and he would wake up panicked, reaching for a microphone that wasn't there. He missed the music. He missed the connection. He missed the specific feeling of the kick drum hitting his chest and the crowd singing, "Here Without You" back to him. He realized that the lyrics he had written half a lifetime ago were coming true in ways he never intended. I took a walk around the world to ease my troubled mind / I left my body lying somewhere in the sands of time. He had left pieces of himself on stages all over the globe. He had given everything he had to the road, and now the road was closed. As November rolled in and the Tennessee air turned cold, the public speculation died down. The news cycle moved on to the next celebrity scandal. The fans, respectful and patient, posted "Get well soon" messages on old Instagram photos, unaware of the gravity of the situation. Brad watched the seasons change from his window. He saw the leaves fall. He saw the frost cover the grass. He knew that this winter would be different. He knew that he was entering the final act of the play. But he wasn't afraid. He had made his peace with God. He had made his peace with his past. The tour was canceled. The show was over. But the man was still there, fighting the quiet fight, holding on to the light as the days grew shorter. Winter in Tennessee is not like winter in the deep south of his childhood. In Escatawpa, winter is just a grayer, wetter version of summer. But on the farm outside of Nashville, winter is a physical presence. The frost bites hard in the mornings. The trees stand like skeletons against a steel gray sky. The days are short, and the nights seem to stretch on forever. For Brad Arnold, the winter of 2025 was the longest season of his life. By December, the scope of his world had shrunk from continents and arenas to the square footage of his farmhouse. The cancer, relentless and cruel, had claimed his mobility. The man who had spent 25 years jumping off drum risers and sprinting across stages was now largely confined to a medical bed set up in the living room, positioned so he could look out at the land he loved. But this chapter isn't about the medical details. It isn't about the morphine drips or the oxygen tanks. It is about the quiet, unpublicized bravery of a man facing the end of his story without an audience. There were no cameras here. There were no fans screaming for an encore. There was just Brad, his wife Jennifer, and the silence. Jennifer became his lifeline. In the history of rock and roll, the spouses are often relegated to the background. But in these final months, she was the warrior. She managed the medications. She fielded the calls from doctors. She sat by his side through the long, terrifying nights when the pain broke through the sedatives. Their relationship, which had survived the chaos of the road and the demons of addiction, was distilled down to its purest form, presence. It was the simple act of holding a hand. It was the silent communication of two people who know the clock is running out and refuse to waste a breath on anything but love. Christmas 2025 was a poignant milestone. Brad insisted on it being normal. He wanted the tree. He wanted the lights. He wanted the dogs running around tearing up wrapping paper. He sat wrapped in blankets, watching his family, his face thin and pale, but his eyes bright. He knew, with the heavy certainty of the dying, that this was the last time. He wasn't buying gifts for the future. He was buying memories. He was curating the final images his family would hold of him. He didn't speak much about the music in these final weeks. The gold records on the walls, the awards, the platinum certifications, they felt like artifacts from a different life, belonging to a stranger named Brad Arnold from 3 doors down. The Brad in this room was just a man trying to make peace with his creator. His faith, which had been the engine of his sobriety, became the anchor of his death. He didn't pray for a miracle. He didn't bargain with God for more time or a sudden remission. He prayed for grace. He prayed for the strength to let go without fear. He spent hours listening to scripture, finding comfort in the promises of a life beyond the pain. There is a specific kind of courage required to die well. It is not the loud courage of a soldier charging a hill. It is the quiet courage of accepting that your body is betraying you, piece by piece, and refusing to become bitter. Brad never asked, "Why me?" He never cursed his luck. He looked at the life he had lived, the kid from Escatawpa who conquered the world, and he felt only gratitude. He had lived 10 lifetimes in 47 years. As January 2026 arrived, bringing with it the biting cold of the new year, Brad's condition worsened. The periods of wakefulness grew shorter. The conversations became more fragmented. But even in the fog, the essence of the man remained. He would still crack a weak joke to ease the tension in the room. He would still smile when one of his dogs rested its head on his legs. The outside world was oblivious. The radio was still playing Kryptonite. The streaming services were still generating royalties. The fans were still posting on forums, hoping for a summer tour announcement. They didn't know that the voice on the radio was fading to a whisper. This was the quiet fight. It was a battle fought in the stillness of 3 a.m. It was the fight to keep his dignity when his body was failing. It was the fight to comfort his wife when she was the one crying. It was the fight to leave this world not with a scream, but with a gentle exhale. He had spent his life making noise. He had spent his life trying to be heard over the crash of cymbals and the roar of amplifiers. But in the end, Brad Arnold found his greatest strength in the silence. He found that he didn't need to be Superman anymore. He didn't need to be the rock star. He just needed to be Brad, and that was enough. The snow began to fall in late January, blanketing the farm in white. Inside, the fire was warm, and the circle of love was tight. The last man standing was preparing to lay down his burden. The fight was almost over. When a rock star dies, the machinery of legacy building usually kicks into high gear. We tend to canonize them based on their excesses, their fashion, or their revolutionary impact on the genre. We talk about Hendrix's guitar, Bowie's personas, or Cobain's anguish. But how do we measure the legacy of a man like Brad Arnold? He didn't reinvent the wheel. He didn't start a fashion trend. He didn't burn out in a blaze of 27-year-old glory. He was, by all accounts, a normal guy who just happened to write some of the biggest songs of the 21st century. And perhaps that is exactly why his legacy matters. In an industry built on artifice, Brad Arnold was aggressively, unapologetically real. He was the antithesis of the rock god archetype. He didn't sneer at his audience. He saw himself in them. His legacy is not found in the critical acclaim he never received, but in the millions of lives he quietly touched with 3-chord progressions and lyrics that refused to hide behind metaphors. Brad's superpower was his plain-spokenness. When he wrote, "I'm here without you," he didn't try to dress it up in poetry. He didn't try to make it clever. He just said it. In a world where irony was the currency of cool, Brad dealt in sincerity. He was the guy who wasn't afraid to say, "I'm lonely, I'm scared," or "I want to go home." This vulnerability resonated on a frequency that bypassed the brain and went straight to the gut. It explains why a soldier in Afghanistan, a single mother in Ohio, and a teenager in Germany could all listen to Kryptonite and feel like the song was written specifically for them. Brad wasn't singing at them. He was singing for them. He was the articulate voice for the inarticulate pain of the everyday American experience. His legacy is also defined by his resilience. The story of 3 Doors Down is a tragedy of attrition. He watched his brothers fall, to drugs, to prison, to death, and he kept standing. He didn't run away. He didn't disband the group to save his own ego. He stayed. He carried the banner because he understood that the band was bigger than the individuals in it. It was a service. It was a utility. People needed those songs, and he was the only one left who could deliver them. Furthermore, his battle with alcoholism and his subsequent recovery provides a blueprint for survival in an industry designed to kill you. He showed that you can come back from the edge. He showed that you can put the bottle down, find God, and find a second wind that is stronger than the first. He deglamorized the tortured artist myth. He proved that you don't have to be broken to be deep. You can be healed and still be powerful. The critics who dismissed him as generic missed the point entirely. They mistook simplicity for lack of depth. They failed to see that it takes immense skill to take a complex emotion like grief or longing and distill it down to a melody that a 5-year-old can hum. Brad Arnold was a master craftsman of the human heart. He built songs like Sturdy Furniture, functional, reliable, and built to last. As we look back on his life, we see a man who bridged the gap between the rock star and the fan. He was the guy next door who made it big, but never forgot where he came from. He never lost the Escatawpa dirt from his boots. His voice will continue to echo in empty arenas during sound checks, in the headphones of lonely travelers, and on the radios of cars driving down dark highways. He wasn't the coolest. He wasn't the edgiest. But he was the most honest. And in a world of noise and posturing, honesty is the only legacy that truly survives the silence. And so, we return to the beginning. We return to the algebra class in 1994. We return to the 15-year-old boy tapping his pencil on a laminate desk, trying to distract himself from the boredom of equations. He scrawls a line in a notebook, unaware that he is writing his own epitaph. If I go crazy, then will you still call me Superman? For nearly 30 years, Brad Arnold asked us that question every single night. It was a question born of teenage insecurity, but as the decades passed, it gathered weight. It became a question about addiction. It became a question about grief. It became a question about cancer. If I fall, if I break, if I am no longer the strong man you see on the album cover, will you still love me? Today, on February 9th, 2026, as the sun sets over the Mississippi pines and the world processes the news that the voice of a generation has gone silent, we finally have the answer. Yes, we call him Superman not because he was invincible. We call him Superman because he showed us that even heroes bleed. He showed us that you can be strong enough to carry the weight of the world, but fragile enough to need help carrying it. He didn't fly over the chaos. He walked through it, right alongside us. The music of 3 Doors Down was never about escapism. It was about endurance. It was about the better life that is always just out of reach, but worth fighting for. It was about the road I'm on, with all its potholes and dead ends. It was about looking at the darkness of the Kryptonite and choosing to keep the light on anyway. Brad Arnold leaves behind a catalog of songs that are now etched into the American DNA. But more importantly, he leaves behind a story of redemption. He proved that your worst days do not define you. He proved that you can survive the bottle. You can survive the heartbreak. You can find peace in the silence. As we say goodbye, imagine the stage one last time. The house lights are down. The crowd is roaring, a sea of lighters and cell phones illuminating the dark like a galaxy of stars. Brad walks out. He looks healthy. He looks happy. He steps up to the microphone, flashes that humble, shy smile, and points a drumstick to the sky. He isn't in pain anymore. The cancer is gone. The demons are gone. Matt is there, tuning his guitar. Todd is there, laughing. The garage is open, and the summer rain is falling on the roof in Escatawpa. The music starts. The first chord rings out, and it never ends. Rest in peace, Brad. You did good. You finally found a better life. Host outro. This has been the Crimson Files. Stories like Brad's are not just biographies. They are mirrors. They remind us of our own fragility and the precious, fleeting nature of the time we have. If you learned something from Brad's life, if his struggle, his redemption, or his music meant something to you, please, do not keep this story to yourself. Share this video with your family. Share it with your friends. Send it to that relative who used to blast 3 doors down in their car 20 years ago. Let them know the full story of the man behind the microphone. Let them learn, as we have, that it is never too late to turn the car around. We have poured hundreds of hours and our entire hearts into creating this tribute because we believe Brad's legacy deserves to be told with dignity and depth. If you appreciate this effort, please subscribe to the channel. And finally, turn on the bell icon. There are many more stories left to tell. Stories of triumph, tragedy, and the human spirit. And we don't want you to miss a single one. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Until next time, keep the music playing.